Good evening and welcome. And I'd like first to say how good it is to be back in the council chamber and seeing all of you here in the flesh. I'm Councillor Dennis Bennyworth, Chairman of Western Area Planning Committee. I'd like to first say a thank you to my predecessors, Paul Bryant, and most recently, Clive Hooker, our new council chairman, for their excellent stewardship, help and advice. Thank you. Other members of the committee joining me this evening are Councillors Adrian Abbs, Phil Barnett, Jeff Cant, Hilary Cole, Carolyn Culver, Clive Hooker, Tony Vickers, who's Vice Chairman, and Howard Wollaston. The following officers are attending to advise and support me in the meeting. They are, to my left, Lydia Mathers, to my right, Sean Cutts. Gareth Dowding is our Highways Officer, Kim Mayer, Legal Advisor, and Mrs. Linda Pye, our Clerk. I'm also assisted by Mr. Gordon Oliver as the Zoom host for this evening's meeting. This meeting is taking place both over Zoom and with councillors present here in the chamber and in COVID-compliant manner. Following the expiry of the emergency coronavirus regulations that permitted remote meetings, all of the council's public meetings must now take place in person at a single specified geographical location, with physical presence at that location. Officers presenting items on the agenda and parish council representatives, supporters, objectors, and the applicant and agent making presentation to the committee have been encouraged to do so remotely via Zoom. The meeting is being live streamed on YouTube, so members of the public are able to follow proceedings. For the benefit of those engaging remotely, I would ask the clerk, Linda Pye, to run through some standard reminders about the way we conduct council meetings via Zoom.
Good evening, Chairman. In addition to the points displayed on the screen, only members of the committee in the council chamber are able to take part in the vote for the formal decision. If we need to adjourn the meeting for any reason, the chairman will advise the revised time and date of the meeting. If it is a short adjournment, then this Zoom meeting will recommence. Otherwise, a fresh appointment will be sent out. Do members have any questions about the way in which this meeting will be conducted?
No, thank you, Mrs. Pye. Before we start the meetings, members, I'd like to send our best wishes, and I'm sure you'll all join me, to Mr. Simon Till, our Principal Planning Officer, who would have been presenting to committee this evening, but is unwell. We wish him a speedy recovery. I'd also like to acknowledge members' concerns about the timings of site visits, and that we'll discuss this matter at the end of business tonight. To be consistent with our council meetings, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind members that we're subject to the council's code of conduct, which requires us to uphold certain standards, those being respectful to each other and to officers and members of the public present. Members may not always agree with one another or with the officer's recommendations, but I would ask that in any disagreements, we're always respectful to others' views and position. I would ask that we're mindful that officers are required to act professionally and impartially at all times in determining applications and in providing advice to this committee, and that they're expected to conduct themselves in a manner which preserves this position of impartiality in all they say and do. We therefore need to maintain mutual trust and an understanding of the position of the legal and planning officers in this committee and of each other. Can I please ask that everyone present switch off their mobile phones? We're not anticipating any fire alarm tests tonight, so therefore, if the fire alarm does sound, please leave the council chamber using the fire exits to the far right and convene the Dolphin car park. Thank you very much. On to item number 1. Mrs. Pye, do we have any apologies this evening, please?
No apologies have been received, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Item 2, minutes. Members, do you have any observation of the very skinny minutes that we have from the 4th of May? Pretty uncontroversial. Can I have a proposer for those? Councillor Vickers, thank you. Seconder, Councillor Williston. Members in favour? Unanimous. Thank you very much. Mr. Pye, these are signed and I'll forward them on to you at the end of the meeting. Thank you. Okay, item 3, declarations of interest. Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chairman. I declare a personal interest in agenda item 4.3 by virtue of the fact that I'm a member of Cheveley Parish Council and was present at the Parish Council meeting when this item was discussed. I confirm that I will consider this matter afresh tonight and weigh up all the information in the officer's report and presented at this meeting before reaching a decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Councillor Abbs.
Thank you, Chairman. I need to declare a personal interest. Two of the applications this evening are from applicant called Revar Limited on St Gabriel Farms. I rent a paddock from Revar Limited. It will in no way, this personal interest will in no way affect my deliberation of the application or the decision I make.
Thank you, Councillor Abbs. Okay, moving on to item number 4 of the agenda. For the benefit of those watching, I'll briefly outline the format of each application. Officers will present the application to the committee. The drawings, site plans, and any deemed relevant materials submitted on the planning file will be shown as part of that presentation, after which representations can be made from each of the following groups and in this order. Firstly, the parish or town council representatives, followed by objectors, then supporters, the applicant and or agent, and finally the ward members. Speakers will be invited to join the meeting in order, either by Zoom or in this room. Each speaker or group of speakers will have a maximum total of 5 minutes to make their case to the committee. Therefore, a group of speakers will need to agree a way of sharing their time allocation. It would be useful to do this now if you've not done so already. Following this, the committee members will then have the opportunity to ask questions of clarification of the speakers. Finally, committee members will have the opportunity to ask questions of clarification of the officers. The committee will then debate the application and vote on its decision. We have 3 applications on the agenda for this evening. As the 4th application, 21/00429, White Lodge, Donington Grove, Donington, has been withdrawn for further consultation. The first application is for 20/02026 St Gabriel's Farm for prior approval and change of use of agricultural buildings to 5 dwellings. I will ask Mrs. Cutt, Senior Planning Officer, to present this application.
Thank you, Chairman. This application is seeking a determination as to whether prior approval is required for the conversion of 2 agricultural buildings to 5 dwellings at St Gabriel's Farm, Coldash. The application proposes to demolish parts of the building which are labelled A and C, which will just appear in just a moment. I think it's about the 3rd slide down. Yeah, this is the site location plan. Here you go. This is the site layout plan. So there are 3 buildings on the site at present, and 2 of the buildings are proposed to be converted to residential dwellings. These are in the lightly shaded area of the plan at the moment, and they are labelled A1, A2 and C1, C2 and C3, kind of at right angles to each other. There will be some partial demolition of the buildings to create some separations, and limited curtilages will be created within the footprint of the existing buildings. The application also proposes the insertion of doors and windows on various elevations. The access to the site is from an existing agricultural access onto Coldash Hill. The site is situated outside but adjacent to the settlement boundary of Coldash and is within the open countryside. It is also outside the North Wessex Down AONB, which is situated slightly further to the north. This application has been submitted under the provisions of Schedule 2, Part 3, Class Q of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development England Order 1995, which I will refer to as the GDPO. This permits the change of use of agricultural buildings to dwellings under specified limitations which relate to the use of the buildings, making sure they've been used for agricultural purposes in March 2013, the size of the dwellings created, whether there are any agricultural tenancies, whether other buildings have been constructed using permitted development rights within the agriculture unit. It limits the amount of alterations to the building, the size, and there are also location constraints. The officer's report, supplemented by the table in the update sheet, provides an assessment of how these proposals meet the limitations within the legislation. We have assessed the proposal in the light of these and consider that the proposals constitute permitted development under the GPDO. However, the developer is also required to submit an application to confirm whether prior approval is required for specified matters and whether that approval is granted. So this application is considering the following matters. These are the transport and highways impacts of the development, the noise impacts of the development, the contamination risks on the site, flooding risks on the site, whether the location or siting of the building makes it otherwise impractical or undesirable for the building to change from agricultural use to a dwelling, the design or external appearance of the building, and the provision of natural light in all habitable rooms of the dwelling. Due to the nature of the site and the location of the site, we have considered that prior approval of these details is required. And it is these issues that I've outlined which the application can be, only these issues are what the application can be determined in accordance with. A separate planning application has been submitted, which will also be considered in this evening's meeting, for additional work to create larger residential curtilages, demolish a third building on the site, create a turning head, additional works to the building such as guttering, landscaping, and additional accesses to each dwelling and a turning head. In regards to the statutory consultations, Coldash Parish Council have objected to the application. Their objections are set out in the report, but can be summarised as concerns about the access, flooding on the farm track, that it is an undesirable development. They also make reference to an appeal on the site, which was dismissed in 2016 for redevelopment works. They object to the design of the development. All other consultees are satisfied with the information that has been submitted during the course of the application and recommend conditions which relate to the matters for which prior approval is sought. Ecology were also consulted on the application due to the potential use of the site by protected species and raised no objections. We received 30 representations on the application. One representation was made in support of the application. And comments made in support of the application are that there would be an improvement because the buildings are an eyesore. New dwellings will enable more people to stay in the village, and the road will take traffic out of the village. There were 29 objections to the application. There is more details contained within the officer report, but the objections can largely be grouped into concerns about access, traffic, speed on Cold Ash Hill and the suitability of the access, noise from traffic on the track to nearby residents, impact on privacy from the track, that it doesn't meet the requirements to be considered under this process, the design of the proposed conversions, the buildings aren't structurally sound, the impact on the rural character of the area, the impact on the gap between Cold Ash and Thatcham, that it isn't a sustainable location and it's outside the settlement boundary, that there's a lack of affordable housing, the impact on wildlife, and impact on drainage on the access track. In moving forward to our appraisal of the site, prior approval is required for the specified matters due to the sensitivity of the application site. Within the update sheet, I have attached the previous previous appeal decision, and I've highlighted within the update sheet that there have been material changes since that application was refused. The previous application on the site was for a whole redevelopment with the demolition of the existing buildings and new dwellings proposed. There were concerns made by the inspector about the design and siting of those buildings and the access track, which at that time had not been constructed. That proposal could not have been considered under the same prior approval provisions, which have also been extended so that a larger number of dwellings can be provided on a particular site. Planning policies have also changed since 2016 with the adoption of the Housing Site Allocations DPD, which replaces many of the policies that previous application was considered under. In turning to this current application, that can only seek approval for the specified matters and for no other reasons. So these being transport, noise impacts, land contamination, flooding, whether the location of or siting of the building makes it undesirable, the design of the building, and the provision of natural light to habitable rooms. So in assessing each of these matters, taking transport first, the highways officer has not raised any objections due to the change in the number and character of the vehicles that would use the track. They have requested that cycle storage and electric vehicle charging points are provided, and these can be secured by conditions. In considering noise, environmental health have not raised any concerns about the noise impact of the development. Nearby residents were concerned about the noise of vehicles that would be using the track. St Finian Farm is the nearest dwelling at about 8 metres from the track. Maybe if we can go back to the location plan, Lydia, it might just show where these other, a little bit hard to tell actually. So St Finian Farm is the nearest, and then other dwellings are approximately 60 to 70 metres away. Given this separation distance and the change from vehicles which could use this track, this is not considered to be detrimental to noise levels experienced within those dwellings. Nearer to the site are two dwellings. There is the bungalow just to the southeast of the red line, and Cedar Haven just slightly to the north. They're closer to the buildings, and again, in comparison to the agricultural use with agricultural vehicles and livestock, change of use to dwellings is not considered to be detrimental to those occupiers. Moving to contamination risks, a study, ground investigation study was submitted with the application. The environmental health officer has looked at these details and concluded that further intrusive site investigations are required to assess potential contamination and remedial works which may be required, and these can be secured via pre-commencement condition. Considering the flood risk on the site, the application site itself is not at risk of flooding, although there were concerns raised by neighbours about the access track, and this will be considered in a concurrent planning application. For the actual application site, sustainable drainage methods have been proposed, and these are considered to be satisfactory and can be secured through conditions. In considering location, the siting and design, whilst our policies focus new development within settlement boundaries, we do have an exception for the conversion of redundant agricultural buildings. However, the consideration within the DPO is on the actual details of the legislation itself and whether the location or siting of the building itself makes it otherwise impractical or undesirable for the building to change. As outlined within the report, there is an access to the site from the existing track, and pedestrian access to the north to the Ridgeway can be provided. Whilst the previous application was dismissed due to the unsustainable location, the GDPO allows for the conversion of these buildings even in unsustainable locations. So the actual siting itself, agricultural buildings tend to be in themselves in unsustainable locations very often. The inspector, in dismissing the previous applications on the site for new dwellings, referred to the size, space and design of those dwellings and their location on the ridge. We are now looking at converted buildings rather than a redevelopment site. And the proposed design retains the agricultural characteristics of the building with the external materials retained, and the relationship with the existing physical features and the landscape and surrounding countryside will be retained. The inspector, in dismissing the previous appeal, was also concerned about the visual impact of the then unbuilt access track. This has now been completed through the full implementation of a previously granted planning permission, which was extant. And so the dwellings will be using an existing track, so no additional harm to the rural setting will be provided. The ecologist has requested a condition for external lighting details to be submitted for approval to protect bats and other light-sensitive animals on the site. And this is considered to be a matter which can be conditioned as it relates to the suitability of the change, given the council's duty of care with regard to protected species. The floor plans submitted with the application also indicate that there will be natural light to all habitable rooms. This application can only be determined in accordance with the specified matters within which I have outlined. Dwellings which are approved under Class Q of the GPDO do not benefit from permitted development rights. And as set out in the officer's report, it is not necessary to add a condition restricting the permitted development rights for extensions and alterations to the building. Having assessed all the relevant matters, it is recommended that prior approval is granted for this change of use, subject to the conditions which is set out in the officer report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cutts. Can we now go to Mr. Dowding of Highways? Is there anything there you'd like to address, please?
No, there isn't. I think what has been said in the report highlighted the fact that a change of use of that site from agricultural to residential, although we'd have a similar number of vehicles going in and out of the site, it would be a complete change in the type of vehicle, the size and frequency. So we're happy with the proposal.
That's very kind. Thank you very much, Mr. Downing. We now move on to our speakers on this application. Can I ask Mr. Oliver, please, to invite Mr. Bernard Clark of the Parish Council into the meeting?
You should be in the meeting notes.
Right, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you?
Mr. Clark, is that you?
It is, hopefully, yes.
Would you like to turn on your video, please?
I'll turn on my video too. Thank you. Sorry about that. It's all a bit complicated.
Mr. Clark, you're very well aware how this runs. You have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. And if you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And also, it's very nice to be able to address you personally after such a long time. You may not feel the same, of course. I have to say that after hearing the officer's report, my response on behalf of Cold Ash Parish Council is going to be a rather more emotional one, which I suspect you were kind of expecting. And it's also been informed by Mr. Butler's presentation or comments at the site visit, which I found very helpful indeed and very clear. What I picked up from that was that there were two issues on which councillors could object to this, but not that many. One was sustainability, and the other was environmental issues. That was what I picked up, and that's what I'd just like to address on behalf of Cold Ash Parish Council. In terms of sustainability, I don't know if you remember the old days when farm buildings had to be attractive and substantial. Obviously under Class Q, that's not the case, but it's very rare for me to have seen such flimsy, such unsustainable buildings. And I know about these things, I've converted quite a few. The foundations are either non-existent, the brick wall is crumbling. This is on one of the buildings. It's an asbestos concrete roof, which would clearly have to go. I'm not sure what's left at that stage. That's the brick-built building, the one that would form two dwellings. The other one, where they're knocking down about a third, is the flimsiest wood. From my examination, it's softwood. It's not even hardwood. I can't imagine how a builder could convert that into a house. So in terms of sustainability, I think it's really, dare I say it, it's almost laughable, really. As far as the environmental issues, I'm going to slew that a little. There's a beautiful field to the north of Cold Ash Hill as you go up it. It's one of the great views of Cold Ash. This requires a track to go through it, a track that's only been put in the last 5 years. And to have traffic going up, it is urbanizing one of our most beautiful places. And I think unnecessarily so. It's despoiling our parish. And there is, as I understand it, a reasonable access coming from the ridge. If this does have to go ahead, I would hope there may be a way of petitioning the Rebar Limited to actually think again and say, no, we don't want a development that's going to drive a wedge right through a beautiful field, an agricultural field that's on a hill. You've all seen it. It's absolutely beautiful. And why would people want to do that? I mean, unless you were a suspicious character and thinking that maybe they want to develop that field, maybe they want to close the gap between Thatcham and Cold Ash. So those are the two main things, saying the access doesn't have to be there. And I believe that if the councillors were minded to turn this down, the developer may well think again. And then you have a very short, very sustainable access from the ridge. Fourthly, the curtilage issues. Call me cynical, but I'm trying to work out why there would be so much change of use in terms of fields. For instance, a paddock being suggested there, if it's not for a purpose other than just having horses or whatever. Well, why would they be doing that? Why would the developers be doing that? And round the back, there's an extension beyond the gardens into a wood, which I think many councillors have seen. Which
1 minute, Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much, Chair. So all round, what I guess we're saying on behalf of Cold Ash Parish Council is there are ways, as I understand it from Michael Butler, to turn this down, and that the developer may well think in the way that we do, which is, as many councillors would understand, well, what do you do with these buildings? I understand your difficulty. I understand what Class Q is about. But there is a better way. There's a way of having access from the north and actually, to be honest, having rather nicer buildings. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me. I hope it made sense, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Mr. Clark, thank you very much indeed. And as usual, you are spot on with your timings. I did nothing less of you than that. We have a couple of questions from members so far. I'll go first to Councillor Vickers.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Clark. You implied that you've got experience of converting buildings. I don't know what your qualifications are, but my question to you is, do you believe from your inspection, if you'll call it that, with us at the site visit, that the buildings, particularly building C, is capable of being converted structurally into a sound, high quality design building?
I can't see. I mean, just to be really honest, if I was doing it, I'd knock it down and start again. So if you take the brick one, Mr. Vickers, the wall is clearly not underpinned. There's cracks all the way along. Underpinning is, well, you know, very expensive. You have to shore up the wall, pour in a lot of cement, etc., etc. On the other building, it's very flimsy wood. I can't think of a carpenter that I've worked with who could make that. So the simple answer, Mr. Vickers, is no. I don't believe it can be done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Councillor Barnett.
Chairman, through you, Chairman. Mr. Clark, you made a considerable play towards the access and what you would love to see if it was a more of a suitable access from the top than what it was from the bottom. Are you suggesting that if that was the case, and obviously it could be a case in a further application or consideration by ourselves, what would you advocate the existing track leading off the bottom of the hill? Would you suggest that that would be an ideal track to be fenced off, closed off?
There will be no need for it. Again, please forgive me for being slightly cynical, but that track only arrived about 5 or 6 years ago, as highways would know. I haven't seen virtually any farm traffic on it. It just feels like we're putting a track in order to service those buildings. But obviously I can't make that allegation. It's questioning someone's motives. But what I would say is that is the Trojan horse into that field. That's the way in, whereas it's not necessary.
Mr. Clark, sorry, one moment. I'll go to Kim Mayer. Would this be relevant in this instance, please, Ms. Mayer?
Relevance in what context? The track?
Yes.
We have to look at the application before us, and the track itself has planning permission. I think Lydia would probably agree on that point that we can't look at something different. But Lydia, I don't know if you can comment, or Sean. That's really it's a planning matter, not a legal one as such, as to whether you could look at that. But sorry, we can't hear you, Lydia. No.
You have to go red at the top.
Sorry, Chair, just to confirm that legal are only allowed to really advise on constitutional issues in the meeting, which is why I'm handing it back to Lydia for that one.
Yeah. Oh, Sean, have you got it? Okay. The track we consider it's a lawful track.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Clark, would you like to continue?
Yes, but I'm sure it is. But that was best necessary for servicing redundant farm buildings over the last 4 or 5 years. But my point is a more, dare I say it, emotional point, which is without that track, you then don't really get that sort of sense of developing that field. There aren't cars going up and down it. It really would change this whole development if if the only access was coming from the ridge, from the north, that would make a huge difference. I think to many of your complainants, I can't vouch for them, of course, but I think it would have a very, very big impact on their sense of significant disappointment of the way it is at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Councillor Cant.
Oh, forgive me, Chair. I thought you made a very pertinent point about whether this track had an existing valid planning consent, in which case I think we seem to be drifting along a long path of who knows where, you know.
I agree. That was my take on it. Councillor Abbs.
Thank you, Chair. I believe, Mr. Clark, you mentioned about the view or the eyesore. It's certainly mentioned in the document. I'm just curious as to where you can really see this building as an eyesore from any kind of building actually that's populated. Certainly wouldn't see it from the bungalows. And the closest I can see is something like 400 meters away. So have you any comment you can tell me where people are saying this is such an eyesore?
Well, I think the people that live along where that track is going, I think they would say that, but then they would say that, wouldn't they? I think it's not really that, to be honest. It is to do with the overall sense of this field, which is a gorgeous agricultural field, suddenly becoming a suburban field. You know, the beginning of traffic going through it and, you know, the whole headlights at night and that kind of thing. But you can see it all the way, you know, as you come up Coldash Hill, it won't be just the roadway that you'll see. You'll see those buildings and in all their glory. And it is a lovely view at the moment. But again, not wanting to sound very confusing, it's to do with the urbanization of that field rather than what happens to the farm buildings, which I can understand something has to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Councillor Hooker.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, Mr. Clark, and thank you for your presentation. Mr. Clark, you made much of in your presentation with regard to whether these buildings could or could not be developed because of their state. From your experience, would you agree with me that that is not a planning issue? That is a risk that this developer has taken on and is prepared, obviously, to underpin and to do whatever needs to be done, both in building control terms and in planning terms. And as I say, it's not a planning issue. I just wonder if you'd agree with me that that is a risk that he's considered undertaking and prepared to do. It'll be passed on to the people who buy those houses.
I think I'd call it a whoops issue. Whoops, the building just fell down. I'm not being silly. That happens the whole time. People start building these things and suddenly it fell down. That's almost certainly, in my view, what would happen there. Now, that's not to undermine the integrity of the builder. I just think that's what will happen. I don't see how you can. And, you know, with all the respect I have for Class Q, and I think it's necessary in agricultural areas to have something like that, I do think that people have to kind of wise up and say, we may have to do something here, but I don't see how these buildings can sustainably be made into dwellings. I hope that answers it. Probably not.
Councillor Cant.
I'm sorry, Chair, to give you such a hard time on your very first time out, but just for complete clarity, just if I could ask Sean Cotts, this construction would be subject to the usual building regulations control, would it not?
We'll have questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I think we're going down a funny path here.
Okay. We do have any further questions of Mr. Clark? No, I think you're in the clear there, Mr. Clark. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed for listening, and it's great to be back, so to speak.
It's good to see you. If I can ask Mr. Oliver to escort Mr. Clark back to the waiting room. Thank you very much. And we now move on to our second speaker, Mr. Christopher Sayre. Mr. Oliver, if you'd escort Mr. Sayre into the meeting, please. Good evening, Mr. Say. Can you hear us? Mr. Say, you're mute. Oh, you're unmuted.
Can you see me now and hear me?
We can indeed, Mr. Say. Yes, I'm sure you know by now how this works. You have up to 5 minutes. And when you're good and ready, I shall start the stopwatch.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening to you all.
One moment, please.
Oh.
And when you're ready.
Okay, good evening to you all. I'm Chris Sayer. I'm one of the Cold Ash residents who are directly affected by this proposed development. I live on Cold Ash. I live on Cornermead, which is one of the roads that actually looks across this tract that Bernard's been talking about. And I can tell you from my property, I can quite easily see both buildings A, B and C on the site, and also have direct knowledge of the amount of traffic on the track at the present time. Let me continue though. Firstly, I have to make some apologies if my comments address areas that are better covered in the supporting application, that's 2002-062 comment. I'm not a local authority planning professional and I'm unclear as to how the subject should really be addressed between the two applications. So forgive me if I stray into other areas. What I would say is that this application is in essence a repeat of that submitted in 2016, which was rejected on appeal to the Planning Inspectorate. It was rejected for a number of reasons. Firstly, the effect of the development on the character and appearance of the area and the natural beauty of the adjacent AONB. This has not changed. Secondly, its effect on protected species. This has not changed. And finally, the development was not deemed sustainable and it remains unsustainable. All of these points made by the Planning Inspectorate are still relevant to this application, as none are invalidated by the revision to change of use as opposed to new build. Though mitigation measures for some areas are proposed, this latest application fails to substantively address these reasons for refusal in any meaningful manner. For example, the current proposal seeks to convert the existing agricultural buildings into dwellings. These are not old wooden or brick barns, but industrial units. They are steel or timber framed with metal and or asbestos-based corrugated sheeting for roofs on basic concrete agricultural slabs. They are not capable as functioning as dwellings without substantial demolition and or rework of the structures and foundations. The amount of work required to convert them amounts to almost to the construction of new buildings and thus may fall outside Class Q acceptance, which requires that buildings are suitable for conversion. I would take a comment from the committee report that states the following. It says, policies CS14 and CS19 require new development to demonstrate a high standard of design that respects and enhances the character of the area, and that particular regard will be given to the sensitivity of the area to change, ensuring that development is appropriate in terms of location, scale and design in the context of the existing settlement form, pattern and character. End of quote. The design and appearance of the residential units proposed is not in keeping with any other housing in the area. The proposed houses would be converted industrial units, steel or timber framed, with metal roofs and timber cladding. The only local supporter of the application describes the current buildings as a bit of an eyesore. I see no reason why this description shouldn't be used for the resulting buildings after conversion. I would also take issue on the subject of sustainability. The committee report implies that sustainability is no longer an issue. This is just not good enough.
That's
West
1 minute, please.
Sure.
I'm sorry, no, that was 1 minute left to speak.
I thought you were telling me to stop. Yeah, West Berkshire Council declared a climate emergency on the 2nd of July 2019. The development of agricultural buildings that rely on all vehicles having to make a journey of over a kilometre, that's 50 metres there and 500 metres there and back, just to connect to the existing road system, is nonsense. The Planning Inspectorate report in 2016 basically said, taking into account the additional length of steep access road, the future occupiers of the proposed dwellings would be effectively isolated from the village, so would be likely to use the private motor car to access most of their daily services. This development is not sustainable. Finally, I'd note that the transportation analysis supporting the application is misleading. The agricultural track was, sorry?
That's 10 seconds, please.
Sorry, the agricultural track was built in 2017, but since then has seen no agricultural use. Any traffic generated on the track will be substantially more than that which the local residents and road network currently put up with.
Thank you, Mr. Sayre.
Okay.
That's your time. Well done. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
We go now to members from questions from members, I should say. Do we have any questions from the committee? I don't see any hands. Mr. Sayre, thank you very much. You got off lightly. If Mr. Oliver could escort you back to the waiting room. We don't have any speakers supporting this application, but we do have Mr. Stephen Smallman, who's an agent, the applicant. Mr. Oliver, if you'd be good enough to invite him in from the waiting room, please.
He should be in the meeting now, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Good evening, Mr. Smallman. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Chairman. Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear and see me.
Yes, I can, loud and clear. Thank you very much. You've heard how this works, and you will have 5 minutes to address the committee. When you're good and ready, I'll start the stopwatch. I'll give you a 1 minute warning and then a 10-second wrap up, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Perfect. If you're good and ready, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. We fully support the planning officer's report and recommendations. The conclusion is clear. The principle of residential development, residential use of the barns is established under the provisions of Class Q, and the related proposals set out in the associated planning application, which you'll debate in due course, are acceptable when assessed against the provisions of your local plan. However, I thought it would be helpful if I responded to some of the questions raised by members on the site visit. I'll also try and pick up on some of the issues that the parish council were just raising. So just in terms of the planning history, the previous scheme dismissed on appeal in 2016 was very different to the current proposal. It was for the demolition of all the buildings on site and the erection of 4 large detached houses. And in dismissing the appeal, the inspector raised concern about the landscape and visual impact of those new buildings, as well as of the access road, which at that time hadn't been constructed. He also questioned whether this was a suitable location for new housing. By contrast, the current scheme simply converts the existing buildings. It also secures the removal of a number of the old buildings. Overall, there is therefore a significant net reduction in the amount of built form on the site, a notable planning benefit. And the access road, as you've heard, has now also lawfully been constructed. The judgment about whether the location is suitable for residential use must now be considered in the context of permitted development rights, and I'll return to that in a moment. I'm going to talk about the relationship between the prior approval and the planning application, but I'll save that for the prior approval application. So talking about the suitability of the site, I want to stress that the scope for considering whether this is a suitable location for housing is now limited by the GDPO. As the planning officer's report makes clear, and as Sian just explained, that judgment needs to be made in the context of the overall provisions of the GDPO, which in principle allow for the conversion of agricultural buildings, which again, as Sian said, are very often within unsustainable locations. And the planning officers also advise, of course, that the siting of the existing buildings to be converted is not harmful to the rural landscape and the setting of the AONB. There's a query about demolition or conversion. I just wanted to clarify that the majority of the demolition works are included within the planning application, not the prior approval submission. And the prior approval proposal is unquestionably for the conversion of existing buildings with only very limited associated demolition works. Some of the existing buildings in theory could be converted without demolition work, but including these works includes a comprehensive scheme that secures significant benefits, which I'll come back to when we talk about the prior approval. There's queries about the future of the farm and the redundancy of the buildings. Class Q does not require the applicant to demonstrate that the farm buildings are redundant, but once Class Q development has been implemented, a farmer has no permitted development rights for the erection of new agricultural buildings on the holding for 10 years. And for your information, the buildings were originally used as a dairy unit, but that ceased in 1988. And the intensity of farming operations has steadily reduced. Today, the farmland is occupied by a grazier and used for grassland production and grazing sheep. None of the dairy buildings at St Gabriel's are therefore required to support the current farming enterprise. There is therefore a major question mark hanging over the future of these buildings. Our view is that the current, and we regard it as a low-key proposal, which secures significant planning benefits, which again, I'll come back to the prior approval, provides the best possible future use for the site. Certainly a better a future than potential alternative uses. I'm thinking,
Smallman, please.
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically of the use of the buildings for storage or industrial purposes, which would be perfectly possible and which would use the existing access. Just in terms of the access onto the ridge, I'd be very interested to hear what Gareth Dowding says in terms of the acceptability of using that existing access onto the ridge, but it is a very poor access. It's very, very restricted. And then in terms of the structural assessment, maybe some questions on this, but the buildings have been structurally assessed, and a scheme of conversion has been drawn up, which demonstrates that they can be converted. They won't
10 seconds.
They won't fall down, and if they did fall down, then the permission would be lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smallman. Do we have any questions, please, members? Councillor Vickers.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I kept waiting for you to come back to the permitted development, which is, of course, what we're talking about. We're talking about the permitted development, Mr. Smallman. Are you really saying, because I've read the structural engineer's report and I couldn't see a scheme of conversion there, but looking at the building and seeing that he only did a visual inspection to come to his conclusion. So are you really saying that you believe that the buildings are capable of being converted structurally without major unreasonable necessary building operations? Because Class Q1I does require the construction work to be reasonably necessary and certainly not to require demolition for structural purposes. I mean, it's got to become a dwelling house, and I could see that it could possibly be converted, particularly building C, from cattle shed to temporary accommodation for evacuees from an emergency crisis. But I really can't see it being converted to quality design. So on what basis are you claiming that it can be?
Well, there has been, over the last few years, a lot of experience of converting farm buildings, many of which, in fact, all of which weren't originally designed for residential use. But Class Q is very clear about the work that can be done to those buildings to convert them. And there's been a lot of case law, and your officers can elaborate, but the Hibbett case is the leading case on when is a farm building converted and when does it have to be rebuilt. And if you apply the sort of a criteria that was considered in Hibbett, it's clear to us that these buildings are capable of being converted, and the works required will not be tantamount to a rebuilding. There's obviously a spectrum with knocking them over at one end and doing no works at all at the other end to bring them into residential use. We are nearer the end where more work has to be done than less work, clearly, because of the type of buildings. But we are confident that we're still within the ambit of permitted development as clarified by HIBIT. And if we're wrong on that, we won't be able to convert the buildings. It's as simple as that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Abbs.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Dick has asked my question.
Thank you. Councillor Cole.
Thank you. Mr. Smallman, you've just said that there won't be a lot of rebuild. How can you claim that there won't be a lot of rebuild when two of the wings of the barn C are going to be demolished, leaving an open framed building just with a roof on it? So there'll be a significant amount of rebuilding.
Well, there is construction works required. And if you look at Class Q, which I'd recommend you all did, you'll see that development is allowed under Class Q, or building operations rather are allowed under Class Q, including the installation or replacement of windows, doors, roofs, exterior walls, and works reasonably necessary for the building to function as a dwelling house. So Class Q does anticipate that there are building works allowed within the overall scope of the permitted development. And I say it has to be a matter of judgment as to whether the works proposed go beyond what Class Q allows. We've looked at that very carefully. The drawings are quite clear as to what will be done and how it will be done. And we believe that we are within the HIBIT boundaries, and your planning officer presumably believes that as well. But as I say, Councillor Cole, if we're wrong on that, and if the buildings do have to be demolished and rebuilt, then we won't have permission to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Small. Any further questions of Mr. Small? Councillor Culver.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Smallman, would you be able to comment on how you would be able to insulate this building? As the previous speaker mentioned that we declared a climate emergency in July 2019. Obviously, we can't impose the kind of requirements that we would like to, because the government rescinded those a few years ago, but perhaps you could outline the extent to which you can provide insulation and what kind of energy grade you think you could achieve with this property?
I've got no idea what sort of energy grade, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm not an architect, I'm the planning consultant, but insulating these buildings are going to involve insulation being attached to the internal elevations and the underside of the roof, and those elevations dry line. So it's not technically difficult to insulate the buildings. They're not going to be carbon neutral or carbon zero rather, but by the nature of the buildings there will be some compromises, but there are ways in which they can be insulated. They've got to be insulated to a certain level to comply with building regulations, and they will obviously have to comply with building regulations.
Mr. Smallman, thank you. I think, and looking around the room, there are no further questions. Thank you very much for your time, and good evening to you. I'm going to ask Mr. Oliver to escort you back to the waiting room, and invite Councillor Garth Simpson to the committee, please, Mr. Oliver. Councillor Simpson, can you hear us? Councillor Simpson, you're on mute at the moment.
Fine. Let me just and video.
We see you. Councillor Simpson,
good nice to see you all.
And good to see you. You've got 5 minutes, Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, sure. Let me get.
You have a minute remaining, and then 10-second wrap up right at the end.
Yeah, sure. Just a minute, I'll get my stopwatch going.
Just let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready. Thank you, Chair, and welcome members. As has been alluded several times, this prior approval is necessary if for extra homes are to be permitted in open farmland in the setting of the AOB. Otherwise, many of the concerns which others have mentioned would still surface as for a new build. I have issues with the design and the siting policies CS14 and 19, and C4 place great emphasis on these. And in using GDPO Class Q, these houses would be locked into low-grade utilitarian barn shed designs in perpetuity. There'll be no disguising the origin of these houses. There's no question of any charm in their layout as a conscious integration with the existing vegetation. It's just what would be chopped out of the existing spread of superannuated dairy farm assets. The parking arrangements and turning head add a congested urban element. And will high quality doors and windows and skylights soften that image? Maybe. And yet point 614 tries to make a virtue of this using GDPO and recycling, saying, as a result of the retention of the existing materials, well, I ask, what materials drawn from my site visit? The same sustainability of the build was cited by the inspector on that last appeal. And the fundamental issue is the build, not the other standards, environmental sensibility. I forget the word. Anyway, if it is feasible, the existing state of these barns, will they not breach quite easily NPPF guidance? Here are some facts. These barns are circa 44 years old. They're lightly constructed with low-cost construction materials, and importantly, with composite structures, which bring their own set of problems with age. Barn C has an asbestos roof. Barn A, in my opinion, as I'm a civil engineer by education, has in structural integrity problems for the very necessary solid gable ends needed. Buildings of this age were built with shallow foundations, and the codes have moved on since then. And climate change certainly warrants them. The site's below the ridgeline and is subject to very strong winds. Both barns have heavy layers of screeded flooring to take farm machinery, dairy equipment, and heavy animals. These floors are often cracked because we have that wonderful heritage Thames Valley clay. These barns have only been partially used, and I've just realized it would seem the fields have been grazed for 33 years. So they've been patched up occasionally for several years, but certainly not maintained accurately. Their condition is simply not good. And the structural report, it was a visual check without exposure of the foundations. Roofs were not checked beyond using a 3-meter ladder. Its recommendation is that it would need a full structural report and the use of specialist timber technology firms and obviously asbestos removal firms to create a believable schedule of works. That is, it was a highly qualified report, and it refers to and I quote, a reasonable expectation that further defects may be revealed. On GDPO, NPPF guidance is clear on replacement works, such as roofs, windows, doors, exterior walls, water, sewage, and power. They must be reasonably necessary, and the demolition—
One minute, Councillor Simpson.
Yes, the demolition accordingly. They must retention and reuse. Class QPSU locks in and perpetuates ugly designs together with further urbanization. These barns are built to low standard, in a poor state of maintenance, whilst materials do not warrant the expense of recovery, let alone recycling. Bernard Clark very candidly reveals the oh whoops theory of recycling and refurbishing old assets. In my opinion, as an ex-civil engineer, Barn C is doubtful of recovery. I do not know how you would rebuild it with the existing timber frame structure.
10 seconds.
So I recommend you refuse this application on the grounds of quality design and sheer unsustainability of build. And please, 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 if you approve, the paddock should have an S106. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Spot on, 5 minutes. Members, do we have any questions of Councillor Simpson?
Yeah.
No, I think you've been let off.
Oh.
Councillor Simpson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Mr. Oliver, if you'd escort Councillor Simpson back into the waiting room, please. Okay, now members, we go to questions of officers for clarification. Councillor Cole first with a hand up. Councillor Cole.
Thank you. Mrs. Cutts, you mentioned the DPD in your presentation, but this site isn't identified in the DPD as a developable site in Caldash. So are you referring to a specific relevant policy in the DPD? And if so, which policy is it that you're referring to?
I was referring to the changes in policy. Was that in reference to what I put in the update
Well,
sheet?
you just said that since the last application, there's a DPD, but there's nothing in the DPD about this particular site at Caldash. So I'm a little bit amused as to what policies you're referring to in the DPD.
Okay.
I presume it's C3, is it?
Yeah, it would be C3 or the conversion of redundant buildings in the countryside. However, I guess I didn't go on to that more because we have to determine this in accordance with that. We have to follow the principles of the GPDO rather than our own policies. So we don't really consider it under that.
Right.
So that's why I didn't.
Another question, if I may, Chairman. There's a lot being said about sustainability. And you're saying this site is sustainable. So what has changed since 2016 when the planning inspector deemed the site was unsustainable to it now being sustainable? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, do you want to come in there?
I believe I'm working now. I've had a quick look on the planning practice guidance, and it talks about sustainability, and if there is a sustainability prior approval for a change to a residential use. And it says that the permitted development right does not apply a test in relation to sustainability of location. This is deliberate as the right recognises that many agricultural buildings will not be in village settlements and may not be able to rely on public transport for their daily needs. So that was the comment that I hope might clarify matters in terms of sustainability of location.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now, I might take these out of order. I'm sorry, you have to forgive me if I do. I picked the hands up a little late. I'm going to go to Councillor Culver first.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to ask for a point of clarity. In 1.4, it says a separate application will regarding demolishing building C. I think, should that say building B?
Yeah, I think that's a typo. It's building B in the next application.
Thank you. And I just wondered whether we were going to specifically look at doing a bat survey, bearing in mind that these are agricultural barns. I'm surprised that there isn't specific reference to bats, because there's probably a fairly high chance that there will be some in there. And as we know, that's particularly sensitive when it comes to planning. And then just the final point that I wanted to make was with regards to flooding. So 6.12, it talks about flooding on the access road and says this is outside of the application site and can be addressed in the separate application. But when you look on page 54, paragraph 6.10, it says that the risk of flooding to the access road is dealt in the application that we're considering now. So should the flooding of the access road be considered in this application or the following one? Because they seem to say contradictory things. Thank you.
Okay, if I take the bats first, there was a protected species survey undertaken, but as a matter of policy, we don't make those publicly available on the website because they can identify sensitive sites. Like if we only show the ones that don't have badgers, it might imply, say, where badgers are, for example. So a survey was undertaken. Our ecologists were satisfied with the details that was contained within there, and he has just recommended, he assessed it on both applications. So I've taken out the parts that we can apply to this application. And whilst ecology isn't specifically listed in the GPDO list of requirements, as a local authority, we have a duty of care towards protected species. So I recommended a condition about external lighting to make sure it doesn't impact bats, but there was nothing, the ecologist didn't recommend anything specific with regards to bats. If I can just, clarify on the flooding issues. The application site for the prior approval is just confined to the buildings themselves in a limited area around it. So that area in itself is not at risk of flooding. And so the flood risk details that were considered were to do with the drainage on the site. I don't really want to go into too much on the second application because we do need to consider them separately. However, that application site has got a larger red line, and that does include the access track and some groundwater flooding there. There was a flood risk assessment which covered that, but I can go back to that when we discuss that application.
Thank you, Mrs. Cutts. Thank you, Councillor Culver. I'm going to go to Councillor Cant.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Sian, congratulations on a very thorough report. I think it was very although quite complex. Could I just ask you three questions? Could you just confirm the question that was raised earlier by the Chair that the access already granted to, by virtue of the road access is already subject to an existing consent, which is what it is? Secondly, there's been a lot of discussion about the construction feasibility or the conversion feasibility of these works. Could you confirm two things for me? One of which is that in the usual manner, the construction as it proceeds will be subject to building regs and building control inspection. And secondly, that should the worst fears of the agent come to pass and it turned out that the demolition or the conversion works were far more extensive than allowed by the development order, that you would step in, or the planning department would step in and stop those works and make that come back as a full application. And thirdly, a very long list of points raised by the objectors, many of which seem perfectly reasonable in the context of the usual planning consent. Is there anything amongst that that you see as a substantive non-compliance with the terms of Class Q application? Or are they all just things that are, things you would normally consider as part of a standard planning application? Sorry, that was rather long, but thank you.
Okay, I think I've got it all. The access, yes, we considered that, and it was lawfully implemented from the 2002 permission. Yeah, the 2002 permission for a new access to serve the farm and replace the existing. The gates were the gates and the access which you used for the site visit. They were constructed within the time limit for commencing the development. The access road itself was then completed in about 2017, I think it was, just going from mapping records. So we've considered that it's a lawful track. On the construction feasibility, yes, a survey was submitted. With the GDPO requirements, the bar isn't set as high for what works are required as they would be if it was a planning application for the conversion. If it was a planning application, we would require very little work. Our policy requires very little work. The bar is set lower under the GDPO requirements. So we've got less information.
Sorry, the GDPR is breached.
So just in terms of what we require, the GDPO allows things like replacement roofs, replacement of walls, which if it was a planning application, for a conversion, we would say that's probably a step too far and not really conversion. I assume it would be subject to building regulations approval. I'm not a building inspector, and so I can't advise on that. As to if it wasn't possible for the building to be converted and more works would be required and it would be a complete rebuild, then it wouldn't constitute the permitted development. And so
and you said if something bulldozed the lot.
If they bulldozed the lot, it would then be a new build and therefore wouldn't come under these requirements. Sorry, could you? I don't quite understand what I've written. I summarise your last question.
Forgive me very briefly, not to drag it out too far. I was just interested to note if on the long list of bullet points that appear under the list of the objectors, whether there's anything there that to you constituted a significant or substantive non-compliance with the terms of Class Q.
Okay, thank you. No, I mean, I consider that the works themselves comply with the basic requirements for what can be considered to be permitted development. In terms of things like the suitability of the access track, the track is there, highways haven't raised objections to that. We can only determine the application on those list of things that I mentioned at the beginning. So whilst there is concern about the external appearance, the impact on the privacy of people using, of the people who view the track, two-way viewing, that's not one of the issues that we can consider. So no, I don't consider that these are things that we can refuse the application.
Thank you, Councillor Kant. Councillor Vickers.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got two questions, Mrs. Cutts, and they're sort of very much sequential, depending on the answer to the first question. The second question may change. But the first question is going back to Q, and it was very helpful that on the update sheet, which you actually didn't refer to in your presentation, you set out, or it may have been Mrs. Mather set out all the details with the answers. And we've heard a lot during the presentations from the parish council and others, and indeed from the applicant. And he brought in an appeal called Hibbett. Now, you did say in your oral presentation at the very start that Class Q limits the amount of alterations to buildings. And it seems, I've read this Q1I many times in the last 24 hours, and it does seem to be very unclear as to what constitutes works proposed, building operations for the installation or replacement of, I'm particularly concerned about roofs, but to some extent exterior walls, in order reasonably necessary for the building to function as a dwelling house, and or partial demolition reasonably necessary to carry out the building operations. Now, we've heard a lot of doubt cast about whether this is within Class Q, even, whether it passes the first hurdle in that respect. And this, if it does, then you have to look at what sort of dwelling house. And you say in para 614 of your report, and you referred to it briefly in your presentation tonight, that it still has to comply with CS14. And CS14 makes reference to CS15, which talks about development proposals being expected to seek to minimize carbon dioxide emissions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, got no doubt it will be complying with building regs, but will it be complying? Does it even need to comply with CS14? And now, is that something we look at having agreed that it passes the test of being under Class Q, or does it even fail that test because it is more than is reasonably necessary to carry out the building operations? I mean, what happens if they start work and then they find it can't hold the weight of a new roof with the necessary insulation, etc.? Oh dear, we have to demolish it. Well, You're not supposed to totally demolish and rebuild a foundation. So do you understand the question I've got? Are we passing that first test under Q1I? And if so, what about CS14 and CS15? Where do we get that passed?
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. A very long question. And yeah, thank you.
Right. I'll try and give it justice. I might need Lydia to help a little bit as well. But I'll start off. As I said, I think in answering one of the previous questions, the bar isn't set as high under these Class Q considerations as they would if we were considering a conversion planning application. The CS15 requirements don't apply. I mean, they do apply to major development, but the requirement for zero carbon building, it's not one of the matters that we could condition the application on, as much as that would be desirable. The list of matters that we can consider just don't include the standard, that level of standard. So it's not a matter that we could condition it on. In terms of if the building is found not to be strong enough, I mean, it's the developer's responsibility to make sure that they actually have the ability to carry out a development. You know, in any planning application, they will also need to meet building regulations requirements, or there may be anything else. If they designed a building that doesn't meet that requirement, then basically that's the developer's responsibility. Again, it would be the same here. If they do more investigation and they find they can't do that, then they won't be able to carry out the development. If they have to apply to us if they then decide they want a new development and demolish the buildings and rebuild, then that will be a new planning application, which would then be considered within the whole realm of the development plan policies.
Sorry, please do.
Yeah.
Sorry, just though, again, looking at the planning practice guidance, I don't know if this might help you. It says that it's only where the existing building is already suitable for conversion to residential use that the building would be considered to have the permitted development right. So the question is, does the structural report demonstrate that it's suitable for conversion for the residential use? And then there are then the limits on the works that can be undertaken, so the walls and the windows and so on, that are limited. Yes, and then it is the Hibbett case that discusses the difference between conversions and rebuilding. I don't know if that helps your question.
Please do, Councillor Vickers.
Is familiar with the Hibbett case. I think it would help us, because I don't want us to refuse and then lose an appeal because of this Hibbett case, which we've only just heard about. Sorry, did you hear that? My red light didn't go on. Could we have a bit more about the Hibbett case, if that is relevant, rather than make the wrong decision and then lose an appeal?
I haven't prepared a statement on the Hibbett case.
I thought you'd say that, Mrs. Ray, that it is a bit of a fast ball, but
if you would like us to, we could go away and if you feel that
short adjournment,
if you wouldn't mind, we would need to, obviously it's a decision by a justice. We would need to probably check with legal as well, just to go through.
Thank you, because Chairman, to me this seems to be the essence of what we're faced with. Is this, reasonably necessary? And what happens if it proves not to be, and you have to demolish it, which clearly isn't. What you just read out in the guidance seems to carry weight for a refusal, to my mind, that it just doesn't meet the test.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Mrs. Mather, how long a period of time do you think it'll take to pull this information?
Could we try 10 minutes? Would that?
Okay, members, are you happy to go 10 minutes adjournment? I propose that we do that. Maybe take a comfort break now. Councillor Abbs.
Chair, is it not appropriate just to get, if we're going to have a break, that we get some of the rest of the questions to officers out of the way?
Yes,
there might be more that
exactly.
needs to go into
Concentrate.
that.
Absolutely, very good suggestion, Councillor Abbs. In fact, you were next cab off the rank, so.
Thank you very
Councillor
much. I will chop off question 2, which was to explain the Hibbett case, so that makes it quicker. The number one question I have, because I've become extremely confused on this timeline of events. 2002, we are saying that permission was given to replace an existing track. Yes. I've never known permission to be given for something that doesn't have an expiry date. So that's the first question mark I have in my head, because then in 2013, it says here that, actually it wasn't used for agricultural use after that date. So, but then 2016, the previous application was refused. And then 2017, they finished building it. And here we are being asked it. How come we have this permission that seemed to be everlasting?
Mrs. Platts.
Okay, that is the way that planning applications are worded, is that development has to commence within a certain period of time. In 2002, it may even have been 5 years that development had to commence within, or it could be 3 years, but certainly our planning applications now, when we issue them, development has to commence within the 3 years. It's more, but there's no detail, there's no time limit as to when that development has to
So my obvious
finish.
question is, what evidence was provided that work was commenced then?
I did check this. I think there was evidence within the planning files on the 2016 permission. There were emails, confirming that gate had been put in. The gate and the access, that was enough to commence the development, because the wording of the permission was to provide a new access to serve the farm to replace the existing. They commenced the development. There was a lawful commencement of the development with the construction of that access point onto Cold Ash Hill. So it was an extant permission when they built the track.
If you don't mind, as we're going off to research stuff, could I have the exact date on which the gate was put in, please?
I'll see if I can
That's
find
something
it.
yes, exactly. We can look at that. I'm going to go now to Councillor Worston, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It seems to be one of the major objections is this track going to the middle of this field.
Sorry, can we have your microphone? Sorry, we can't hear you. That doesn't seem very clear from here.
Thank you. Is that better? It's red on here. It's just not on. Oh, that's how this is working, is it?
We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
that's fine.
That's great. It seems to me one of the major objections is probably this track that goes up to the buildings, the existing farm buildings. I just wanted to ask Mr. Dowding whether an access off the ridge would be an alternative solution or not.
Again, I think, Councillor Williston, that's not subject for discussion for this evening.
Thank you.
Would you like me to confirm, Mr. Chairman?
I think Mr. Downing, I think we're clear on that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wilson, do you have any further questions? Thank you very much. I'm going to go next to Councillor Barnett.
Chairman, but actually Councillor Wilson partially asked my question, but you're indicating it's perhaps not necessarily relevant. It was really, it was actually to Mr. Dowd in relationship to the vehicle movements and the comments made by the objector in relationship to possible movements, and also the visibility on the corner. So that's really my question in relationship to follow up from Councillor Williston as well.
Thank you, Councillor Barnett. Mr. Dowding, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have to be careful here because obviously the access track has already got permission. So therefore visibility and its use has already been determined. So we are using existing track here out onto Caldash Hill. With regard to traffic movements, we are working on the principle that traffic movements associated with a farm of that size, if it was in use, and we have to assume that at any point that farm could be reused, that traffic associated with that farm would be equal to the traffic associated with any possible development which may be approved as per this application.
Thank you, Mr. Dowding. Councillor Vickers, I think you indicated we should speak. No. If members are done, then I think we'll take Ms. Mathers, a 10-minute recess.
Yes, please.
Okay, 10-minute recess, members, and we'll convene at 8:15. Mr. Oliver, we're back live again, and welcome back, members, and anyone that happens to be watching in. We just had a short recess there. Well, for clarification, I'm just going to hand over to Mrs. Mathers.
Thank you, Chairman. So the Hibbett case, essentially, in that particular example, the building was effectively just a roof. All four walls had to be constructed in order to, so full works are essentially required. The High Court judgment was that there is a line between rebuilding and conversion. However, it's a matter of planning judgment as to where that line is. It's not predefined. I know I didn't think you would like the answer, and it's also it is a requirement. If rebuilding is required, then the permitted development right, as I read out before, would not apply. So having reviewed the structural report, and on the basis of that the buildings are, they already have walls and roofs and so on, officers consider that it is conversion and not rebuild. So we're not starting afresh, I think, is essentially what the High Court decision was. If you're starting afresh in some way, if it's more rebuilding and there's not much of the structure that you can use. So in that particular example, there was little of the original structure that would be part of the dwelling. That was, sorry, my rather quick summary of the finding. Sean can list the structural report where it states the works that are required, if that would assist you.
Thank you, Mrs. Mathers. I'm going to go first to Councillor Vickers.
That was helpful. Thank you. I think it was worth the adjournment. So basically, we're looking at, it's past the Class Q test, and we're now looking at the character and appearance. I think that was the second question I asked, which has nothing to do with Hibbett. Where's the list? I think my question was, I think in para 614, you say that it still needs to be of high quality design, and that's referencing CS14, but you're saying that because it's not major development, where CS14 references CS15, CS15 doesn't apply in terms of the renewable energy part of CS15 because it's not major development. Is that the situation? So we can't demand any particular renewable energy standards?
No, that's my understanding.
Well, thank you, but no thank you, if you know what I mean.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Councillor Cole.
Thank you, and thank you for that and the trouble that you've taken to get that clarification. But I would, the point I'm making is, if you look at page 40 on your agenda, you've got them and the building C. You've got that main building, and you've got two wings. Now, if those two wings are demolished, which they're going to be, you're just left with a frame and a roof. Now, that will surely require a major rebuild. Or is that a matter of planning judgment?
Mrs. Mathers, I think you covered that in the last your last point. Would you like to address Councillor Cole, please?
Yeah, planning judgment.
Planning judgment. Okay, and in your judgment, it's not a rebuild.
Yes.
Okay, but it could be. The committee could have a contrary opinion.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Abbs.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to come back to the energy standard just for a moment and get officers' advice here. I was recently at an appeal process where the appellant's QC argued that, in fact, we could apply our standards as defined in our local plan of some time ago, and that said from 2016 onwards, new builds should be net carbon zero. Why is it if the QCs are arguing that, you know, we can do it, the appellant's QC, why are the officers not saying that we can in fact apply this?
I can answer that. Yeah, in this case, this isn't a major development. It doesn't come under the category of a major development, so therefore that doesn't apply. And also, it's not one of the matters within that list that we can condition. But then Class Q development will never be major developments because of the size limitations within it.
So the answer would be different. As long as they're major developments, we in fact can therefore apply CS15 and carbon net zero homes. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, do you want to just, I think so.
Yeah, so this is an application under permitted development rights, so we can't apply that policy. But yes, you're right, for other major developments that are under a full application, where all of our planning policies are the starting point for the decision making rather than the permitted development rights, then yes, they would apply.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Councillor Vickers, I know your hands is up. Is it a question or?
No.
No?
No, that's up for the debate.
Okay, well, I think at long last, members, we've got there. It's, unless there are any further questions of officers.
Yes, Chair, I was awaiting the answer of exactly when the gate was installed.
I've been able to find that out as well. And there's emails within the file saying the bell mouth and visibility displays were constructed in 2004. And then there was officer emails in 2017 confirming that the construction of the track was in accordance with that permission.
So because that display existed in 2004, that's why it was allowed to be built. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cutts. No further questions? I'd like then to open the debate. Councillor Cant.
I'm sorry, Chair, but I'm still, perhaps, you know, the thing that really bugs me about this, I mean, I pretty well always back planning officers' recommendations because generally speaking, they're pretty well spot on. Where I'm really struggling with this one is, and I think Councillor Cole referred to this by taking us back to one of the pictures on page 40. I cannot see, I'm not an architect, obviously, none of us are. How can we judge this? But I'm struggling to see how you could take that ugly, redundant, cheap concrete building and put housing there without substantial rebuilding, which doesn't seem to fit with the view of this Hibbert case. I just don't get it. I mean, if it was, I understand why this exemption was granted. It was meant to, I guess, primarily old-fashioned brick constructed farm buildings where the farmer needed to reinvest in the farm, got them converted, but they were substantial brick buildings and used them. But these seem to be, I just struggle. Could you? I just feel really, I'm struggling with it.
Councillor Cant, is that a question to officers or we had started the debate?
Yeah, no, I just wonder if anyone else has that feeling that everyone else is convinced that this is this feels like feasible. Just looking at the pictures, doesn't seem feasible, I guess.
Thank you, Councillor Abbs.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think Ms. Mather can convince me and in what she said when she referred to the Hibbert case, and that this is basically a judgment that we can make as to, as Councillor Canty just said, whether we believe this is feasible and reasonable within the auspices. I conclude that I don't see how it's reasonable. So when you are ready, Chair, I'm absolutely willing to come forward a proposal to not accept officer recommendation and refuse that, but you may want more debate, so just call me back.
I'm quite happy for the debate to run on. I note the proposal there. I've got Councillor Vickers next.
Chairman, I would be happy to second that proposal, and I think my reason is around I cannot see how it can meet any kind of quality design. I accept that it may be, and I haven't seen the plans from the previously refused full planning application, and it may be less intrusive in the landscape, but it's still not, as I quote from the inspector's report, it has little in common with true vernacular architecture. Now, I don't see how with a metal roof you can have any kind of quality design, particularly have it, in a sense, true vernacular architecture. And now, I accept that it passes the test and it can be considered under Class Q, but I feel that we are able to refuse it on the basis that it doesn't satisfy, where is the list? Preliminary matters, isn't it? Here we are. Para 3.1 on page 11 of our agenda fails under design or external appearance. And I think, that's it. I accept that the access is not relevant. I accept there are no transport conditions. It's really the only reason for refusal that I would second Councillor Abbs's proposal under.
Okay, I've got Councillor Barnett next, please.
Sorry, Chairman. Sort of taken a bit by surprise. I didn't realise I was next in the pecking order. I mean, I go back to last Thursday. I mean, my immediate reaction on site was, surely, come on, this is just not feasible. This can't be achieved. And that was my immediate reaction. And should be a clean slate, start afresh. It's sort of your immediate reaction. Then one obviously listens to the views of different people in relationship to what is achievable, what can be undertaken, and one tends to think perhaps slightly different. And obviously I've listened to the comments that's been made around the table tonight, and also the officers' views, and I'm sort of under the impression that yes, it can happen. It could be undertaken, but there's a big but all the way along the line. But if this, but if that, and my reaction really is perhaps of a similar nature to what we've just heard for the last three speakers. One doesn't want to necessarily disagree and disapprove and then turn down this particular application, but one feels that that this is not really an ideal situation that we should be in, and I do feel to a certain extent that I'm sort of coming to the conclusion that I'm returning back to where I began the process last Thursday morning, and therefore I do feel that I'm obviously going to support what's just been said around the table.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go next to Councillor Hooker.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to stir the waters, stimulate a bit of debate. I come back to Councillor Vickers' comment there about, what can a building look like with a metal roof? Now, I've seen barn conversions in my area that have had metal roofs, and they do look quite attractive. In my little presentation tonight, one of my concerns was that if a metal roof was used, it certainly would need to be dulled, which it can be. Obviously, my concerns being such a large reflective area in a prominent position. But metal roofs are used, and they can be coated, and at the end of the day, it proves weatherproof. We were talking here about whether this would be failed under its design. We've got the designs in front of us, and design, as we know, is subjective. I mean, to me, it reminds me of 1950s, and I may give my age away a bit here, of military barracks accommodation. Yeah. But don't forget, this is driven by policy. They can't knock these things down. They've got to do something which is there already. Now, if it was in a state where it was in good fettle and all you would do is put up some insulation on the inside and what have you, if we say we're going to fail it under design, you're committed to that design anyway, because you can't do anything else but renovate what's there already. So the new world with younger people on a nice location, with a nice interior, with a geeky outside design may not be to our taste, but just a consideration to others it will be. And these properties, because of the work that we've already identified needs to be done, will not be cheap. These will be expensive properties, in fact, of the amount of work that's got to be done on them to make them habitable. But equally, we were talking about it would be an eyesore. Is that farm site already not an eyesore? It sits in a prominent position. It would be improved if that big barn was knocked down with conditions, as I say, of non-reflective roofs, of some sort of lighting strategy, so that at nights it wasn't prominent. It might be considered okay. It's sympathetic to the surroundings. We looked at that. The garden's finished. It then went off into the woodland, and there were conditions there that it looked after the extremities of the site. So that's my thoughts on it. I've not made a decision. I've only heard a couple of the arguments here, but just to push back on the comments that were made and other things that might have to be considered, where the inspector might go, well, what do you expect? This guy's got to somehow renovate these. Policy says I can't knock them down. He's had to go at 4 houses. That was already rejected. All he can do is tidy up what's there and retain those shapes. And they've knocked bits and pieces down to give the residents some feel of independence and separation. That is where it's erred from a total refurbishment as opposed to some demolition. So that's my thoughts, just to stimulate a bit of discussion.
Councillor Hook, I think it's worth bearing in mind, as Mrs. Mathers was mentioning, the case law which proceeds, and it doesn't appear that one needs a great deal of the building left to make something else of it. Yeah, that'd be a fair assumption. And also, I'd like to say there's a very expensive converted grain store not 2 or 3 miles from me, admittedly over the boundary in Wiltshire, which is I think fetched upper 6 figures, if not 7 figures. But that's by the by. Councillor Cole.
Thank you. The grain store isn't over the boundary in Wiltshire. We did the site visit there.
My apologies. That's quite right. It is.
Some years ago, but I recall going there. I think this hinges really on whether the works proposed go beyond Class Q and permitted development. Is it suitable for conversion, particularly in the building C buildings? All 4 walls have to be rebuilt, and it is a matter of planning judgment. The fact that the committee's judgment may be different to the officers on this occasion is that's what committees are for. And interestingly, although we're not discussing design here, paragraph 124 of the framework says the creation of high quality buildings and places is fundamental to what the planning and development process should achieve. Good design is a key aspect of sustainable development. And we're not discussing design here, but I think the design leaves a lot to be desired. But I think my view is very much, do the works proposed go beyond what is a Class Q and permitted development? And in my view, they do.
Sorry, Councillor Cant.
Thank you. I concur exactly with what Hillary's just said, and I think it's dawned on me gradually that what's been missing from this whole discussion is that the single biggest issue about granting consent for this, for us, I think, is whether it reaches exactly what Hillary's just described, that it goes beyond the Hibbert case or strays into the land of this Hibbert case, if that's what it's called, and becomes effectively a redevelopment. And we have nothing in here to tell us anything about that. If we'd had a presentation from the applicant saying this is what it'll look like before, this is what it'll look like after, this is what will be knocked down, this is what will be left up, we'd have a better sense of that, but we don't have anything to go on. So I'm completely with Hillary. I'd be inclined to vote against this on the basis we've got insufficient information to convince us that that is going to be the case.
Thank you, Councillor Cant. Anyone else wishing to speak? Oh, Councillor Adams, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's really just coming back onto Councillor Hooker's excellent comments. That they must do something with it, can't knock it down. Well, it's a greenfield site because these are what these are. So they could knock it down, but they can't put anything back up in its place. So they can do something else with it. They could return it to fields. So there is, they have choice. This is I would like to build a house for profit. It's not quite as black and white as that, but anyway, there you go.
Thank you. And Councillor Vickers, first your hand.
I'm inclined to withdraw my seconding of Councillor Abbs's motion, because I think we need to test the other idea. I mean, I was sort of persuaded by Mrs. Mather that it does pass the Q test, and it therefore, regrettably, probably does meet the test. But if members go with what you're saying, Councillor Cole, and I believe you might have a seconder if it comes to that, and if officers are saying that it is our judgment on that, I'd say put your proposal, unless somebody else is seconding Councillor Abbs's, who got his in first, Chairman.
Councillor Vickers, you're making this all very difficult for a rookie chairman, I have to say. Do I have a new, having noted your withdrawal of your seconding of the proposal, do I have a seconder for Councillor Abbs's proposal?
The proposal was to reject.
Was to reject. Okay, so I have unless members have anything.
I mean, if this proposal fails, I may come back, and support Councillor Abbs, but I think it's right that we test this one first.
We have a proposal on the table, Councillor Cole. I'm looking for a seconder to Councillor Abbs's proposal. Councillor Cant, I have a seconder. And Councillor Abbs, reasons for refusal.
Indeed, and I think they've already been expounded by Councillor Cole and others, but basically we do not feel this passes the test set out for Class Q transformation.
I think should we consider whether we might say there's insufficient information supplied to convince the committee that it passes the test set by him.
I'm happy to take those extra words. I'm not sure what.
Gives us a little door open to say.
Sure.
We're not just rejecting because we don't agree with the report, but saying we don't have enough information to make that door action as far as I can see.
Well, everything's.
Councillor, through the chair, please. Councillor Abbs, are you happy with that?
I was quite happy to reject it, and the reason for rejecting was I didn't think it passed the test that we needed to set for ourselves. If we want to add extra things on top of that, I'm quite happy to do that. Are others not allowed to add additional reasons on top of mine?
Absolutely. I'll come to Councillor Hooker.
Well, if the argument is going to be made that we haven't got enough information, then are we considering that we defer it until we did have extra information, as we did on the question of Hibbert?
And I would have called for a deferral instead, but
I'd be perfectly happy to see it come back with a much better explanation of what's actually going to take place in the course of this work. And to convince us, I know the panelists are distrusting, but they say they're convinced it is the case.
Sorry, can we put microphones on, because we can't hear you.
My apologies. I was merely saying that it would be very good to see at some point. It may even if we reject it, it's resubmitted, it may happen, to see a much better explanation of how this doesn't breach the ruling in Hibbert.
Well, actually, if I may, Chair, I think we need to get a legal ruling. We've had, it's been put a proposal, it was seconded, that was withdrawn, it was seconded again. What is the constitutional situation? Do we not need to take a vote on something that's been put forward and seconded? And if you then want to go for deferral later, fair enough. But
if I can just go.
Can I just jump in here slightly? I think the initial proposal didn't include the insufficient information, which I think has kind of muddied the waters somewhat. So you either have to go back to the original proposal with a seconder for that, or we have to scratch that proposal and a second one. But insufficient information, to my mind, does raise that possibility that actually, if you have an insufficient information, you ought to be deferring in order to make the decision with all the information you require.
So in that case, Mrs. Mayor, we'd be looking for the proposal to withdraw the proposal and the seconder to be inclined to agree.
Chairman, I would argue that we have got sufficient information. before us this evening. We've got a very detailed report, which Councillor Cant has already complimented Mrs. Cutts on. We've got an awful lot of information in the update sheet. We shouldn't, as a committee, be afraid of making a determination on the information before us this evening. The fact that we are determining it against officer recommendation, I think we've got quite clear reasons for that, because the work proposed goes beyond what Class Q allows. End of. Is it suitable for conversion? No.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Gott. I'm going to come back then to...
So I would...
Chair, if I could just briefly, I'm happy to take a straight vote and withdraw my suggestion we defer it and just take a straight vote on pass or fail.
Thank you, Councillor Cant. Councillor Abs, as proposer, are you happy?
More than happy to go with the original proposal to reject, and as it's been seconded, and please put it to a vote.
Thank you, Councillor Abs, and for the reasons previously stated.
Yes, they're not meeting the criteria.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm sorry, Councillor Cant was seconding. Sorry, seconding.
Yeah, seconding it.
Thank you very much. I'll take a vote on that, please. Will that be done? I'm sorry. Will that be done through the through legal or
no? We're back to a show of hands again.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll take then a show of hands. A proposal by Councillor Abs, seconded by Councillor Cant. The recommendation is that the head of development and planning refuse prior approval to the change of use of agricultural buildings to 5 dwellings subject to conditions. Can I have a show of hands, please? That's unanimous. Members, thank you very much, and a baptism of fire. I think. Thank you very much for that. Yes, older and wiser. Moving swiftly on, I think the comfort break's been done and dusted, and we'll move then on to item 2. I'm not going to read this out in its full. To save time, we have item number 2 on the agenda, 20/02062 St Gabriel's Farm. Mrs. Cutts?
Chairman, can I just ask for a legal clarification? Have we got to hear this application? Because it doesn't stand, because the prior approval has been refused. And I understood from Mr. Butler at the site visit that you can't have one without the other. So I wouldn't want us to waste and spend an awful lot of time debating an application that won't ever be can't be built out because prior approval's been refused.
Thank you very much. I shall go upstairs again to Mrs. Mayor, I think, for your advice on this.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, but a second time tonight, I would be grateful if I could just have 5 minutes just to double check that, if I could possibly. My understanding is that one hinges, one is predicated on the other, but I would just appreciate 5 minutes if I could.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Mayor. I shall.
Mr. Chairman, maybe perhaps move on to the other application and then come back to this one.
If we're happy to do that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, Chair. If you have the discretion to change the order if you wish.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Councillor Wollaston, for the suggestion. Then we're moving swiftly on to the third item on the agenda, 21/00412 Hazelhanger Farm, North Heath, Cheveley. Mrs. Mathers, you good and ready?
Thank you, Chairman. This application is for the change of use from a guest house to a dwelling. The site is outside of the settlement boundary, so is in the countryside and in the AONB. The building and curtilage are shown in the red line. As the update sheet notes, this is the limits of the curtilage and the proposal does not include an extension to it. Access is from Cheveley Byway. which is shown in the agenda on page 95. On site is the building, a bike store, paved area and gravel parking area. As shown on the plans, there is a covered terrace and balcony which serves as amenity space. The use as a guest house was granted under permitted development for flexible uses in 2016, along with the works to convert the building to the guest house in 2017. The consultation responses are set out in the report. Cheveley Parish Council objects to the proposal and have made a subsequent representation after the update sheet was published that in their opinion, the conversion from an agricultural building to a dwelling would not have complied with policy C4. Highways request an electric vehicle charging point. Conservation suggests a condition to remove permitted development rights. There are 2 letters of support and 1 letter of objection. The points they raise are set out in the report. The report sets out that the impact on the amenity of neighbouring residents is considered to be less than the existing use. A pre-commencement condition has been agreed for an electric vehicle charging point, and the highways impacts are considered acceptable. The impact on the setting of the nearby listed buildings is considered acceptable by the Conservation Officer, and the impact on the character of the area is considered no greater than the existing use. The main issue is therefore that of principle. The report sets out that the change of use were generally accorded with policy C4, which allows for conversions. The conversion works for the guest house were granted and have been completed, and no external works are proposed for the change of use to a dwelling. The report and update sheet notes that the existing guest house use would have a benefit to the rural economy with regard to local tourism and accommodation. The loss of existing rural enterprises should be demonstrated not to negatively impact the local economy under policy CS10. Information on the lettings and the guest house business was requested but not provided. A dwelling also has economic benefits, albeit not rural tourism, and the permission for the guest house under permitted development rights did not include restrictions on guest stays or seasons. The change of use and occupation as a dwelling would not therefore be dissimilar to that of a guest house. Indeed, the original permission included accommodation within the guest house for the owner. Officers consider that overall the proposal complies with the development plan, and the loss of the rural enterprise in the planning balance is not considered sufficiently harmful to warrant refusal. Conditions are recommended as outlined in the main report. The conditions do not include restrictions on permitted development rights. The site has limited curtilage beyond the footprint of the building, and where it is in the AONB, there are additional restrictions on permitted development rights. For example, no side or 2-story extensions, no upward extensions or additions to roof. That's not exhaustive, but that's examples of restrictions for properties in the AONB. So the recommendation is as in the main report, which is for approval subject to conditions. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mayor. We have no, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to Mr. Dowding. Are there any highway issues with this application that you'd like to address?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, absolutely not. There's no comments that we've got to make on this because it's virtually a like for like.
Thank you very much indeed. We have no parish representative, nor objector, nor supporter. There's no applicant or agent speaking, and I'm now going to pass over to the ward member, Councillor Hilary Cole.
Thank you.
Councillor Cole, if you just give me one moment to start the clock.
Thank you. Is the microphone working? Where do I turn it on? Oh, I think it is working. Got it? Okay.
Councillor Cole, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This agricultural building was granted prior approval for change of use to a guest house in 2016, which is why I was unable to call it into committee at the time. 2017 saw full application in line with the prior approval of windows, external doors, cladding materials, cycle and recycling storage. So at that stage, there was little point in my calling it in because of the prior approval. However, this new application for change of use from class C1 to C3 dwelling house has caused me sufficient concern to call it into committee. Although the conversion is of an extremely high standard and the dwelling is visually very attractive, and the applicants have done nothing technically wrong in the way in which they've approached this conversion, I believe this is a good example of development by stealth. Although the report states that had the change of use been considered as part of a full application, it's likely that it would have been in accordance with policy C4 of the HSA DPD. I contend that this is conjecture on the part of the case officer, as this opinion has not been tested at committee. Turning to this application, the NPPF framework was revised in February 2019 and sets out the government's economic, environmental and social planning policies for England and details how these are expected to be applied. Officers have been given firm direction to apply additional weight to this overarching economic objective, which is a material consideration when determining applications in order to aid the recovery of the local economy post-COVID. Although the hospitality industry has been hardest hit by the COVID pandemic, now that we're coming out of it, it's in the strongest position to recover. UK holiday accommodation is at a premium because of the uncertainty around travelling abroad. And yet here we have an application for change of use from a guest house to a domestic dwelling with no justification from the applicants to substantiate the lack of viability of the business. I'm therefore somewhat bemused by the officer recommendation to grant approval, as I think it's premature. What I would request is that the committee refuses this application by, say, a 2-year period in order for the applicants to build up a viable business. But if the committee chooses to approve this application, then I request that additional conditions are applied. And these are, number 1, lighting, low-level external lighting only to be used. Currently, there's a very strong floodlight on the western elevation, which can be seen from the public rights of way, and it's intrusive in this dark skies area of the AONB. Number 2, the gravel driveway, which members noted on the site visit, leading from the western elevation to public footpath 15, be removed. This is not included in the red outlined area showing the curtilage of the application site and was never used as a farm entrance. And number 3, the barn, which is shown on the block plan, but is also not included in the curtilage. I'd like this to be conditioned that it should only be used for storage in order to avoid further development on this site. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Do we have any questions of the ward member? Councillor Vickers.
Yeah, I'm not quite clear why you think this is unsustainable, given the great changes we've seen during COVID. I can imagine somebody living here. It's next to an existing dwelling where presumably just across the track. I mean, you'd need probably a occasional 4-wheel drive Ocado van to deliver your groceries, but apart from shopping, I would have thought that sustainability, if you're thinking of the amount of transport that it generates, the daily commute, that we passed the days of a daily commute. So what's the problem with sustainability?
Sustainability, Councillor Vickers. My argument is that approval was granted for a guest house, and the applicants are saying that the business is unviable as a guest house, but it's not been tested or marketed, and they are saying it's not viable as a guest house because of COVID. And my argument is we're coming out of COVID and therefore it can be viable as a guest house, but they have chosen to want to convert it into a domestic dwelling without even testing the business of it being a guest house. It was granted C1. It's never been used as C1, and it's been wanting to convert it into C3, a dwelling, without even having proved that it's not viable as a guest house. And that is my argument.
Okay, because you started by saying that if this had been an application, it would not have been approved under sustainability grounds because of its location.
C1, I mean, it would have been approved under C4. I would have thought policy C4, which is conversion of rural buildings to domestic. So it's policy. It hinges on policy C4 and also the conversion from C1 to C3 without the C1 guest house having been.
Okay, so it's a different argument.
Yeah.
Sustainability early on in the context of conversion. If it had gone straight as an application to convert to a dwelling, then we'd have looked at sustainability. And you think it would have failed? That was my question. Why would it have failed given the current circumstances of change of working habits and so on.
Can't say this
But I can see you've got another argument, which is to do with make them test the economic viability of a guest house.
Tested.
Yeah. Okay, that's
That
a different
was my
argument, but that's fine.
But if
Thank you.
members choose to approve it, then I want extra conditions
Yeah.
to ensure that that site is
Happy with those
safeguarded.
conditions, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions of Councillor Cole? Councillor Adams.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Cole. You mentioned the building next door and that you wanted to put some constraints on that, conditions on that. What led you to say that? Was there anything that you saw on the site visit? There seems to be something that you saw.
On the site visit, I noticed a window had been put in now, and we were told on the site visit by the applicant that it was only for storage. Now, my view is if you're using storage in of machinery in a rural area, then you don't put a window in it for people to look through it and see what's in there. So that's just my.
Did you also note the high quality front door that was fitted to the same building?
Yeah. So it's outside the curtilage, so it's not something that we can discuss, but it's just something that I wanted to draw members' attention to prevent any further development on that side.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Any further questions of the ward member? You may take your seat. Okay, members, any questions of clarification to the officers, please? Councillor Culver.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Can I just clarify, is it necessary for an applicant to provide justification about the fact that they don't think the business is viable anymore? Or do we just have to take their word for it? And I also acknowledge what Councillor Cole said about the fact that we now give some consideration to the economy, but have we actually, I probably ought to know the answer to this, so apologies if I should know, but have we actually enshrined that in policy now that we have to give consideration to economic factors? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we don't have, for public houses, we have an adopted supplementary document that does require marketing for 6 months and viability information. That wouldn't apply to the guest house. However, in the update sheet, I refer to policy CS10 on the rural economy, and that references, I'll just read it out for an easiest, that proposal seeking the loss of existing small enterprises in rural areas must demonstrate it does not negatively impact upon the local economy, vitality and viability of the surrounding rural area. So that would be the test under CS10, but it's not set out how that's to be achieved in the way that the supplementary document for public houses is. In terms of the economic, I think the MPPF requires us to balance, or in the planning balance, to consider environmental, economic and social impacts of development. And officers have been guided that we should give additional weight, if that's the right way of putting it, to the economic factors at this present time. I hope that answers the question. Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Mathers. I saw another hand, Councillor Vickers.
Thank you, Chairman. Mine's also referenced to the update sheet. It's the sill question. That says, if it's demonstrated that the lawful use of the building was in use for at least 6 continuous months to 3 years prior to now, the lawful use of the building being as a guest house, is that right? But that's not a residence, which would, I mean, to be liable for sill, it has to be used as a residence. And going forward, if we were to approve it, it would be. But in terms of the historic use, are we talking about, I mean, does having guests in the guest house constitute being used as a residence?
Sorry, it might not be clear the way it's, so as part of the change of use to a dwelling is still liable, but the charge as I say, it could be. I'm not within the SIL team, so I've just asked for clarification because a question was raised on this. It's a separate matter in terms of planning considerations,
Right.
but in order to answer the question. So it would need to be demonstrated that the existing lawful use within the last 3 years was continuous within that 3-year period for 6 months. So that might be the agricultural use, because that will have potentially applied within the last 3 years,
Yes.
or the guest house use. So a guest house use would be paying guests rather than visitors.
So you'd have to have one guest staying for 6 months, because it wouldn't be continuous otherwise. You'd have the days
I guess,
when you change.
or a number of guests over a 6 month. Yeah, I guess they would have
Anyway.
to
Or it's
demonstrate.
being run as
Yeah.
a business, I think, possibly. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a viable.
Anyway, it's not
concern.
something that we actually have to or can consider, because that's something that you consider afterwards under the SIL regulations.
Yeah, the
is it?
SIL regime runs separately to the planning process.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Mathers. Councillor, because you've finished there, Councillor Arabs.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It really comes back to when planning permission was first given for use. But because I'm being asked to judge, well, we're going to lose a little bit. We might lose, but we don't know how much we're going to. When it got approved, one assumes they came to us and said, we want to make this conversion into a guest house because we're going to make this much money. Here's our business plan. And that's why I assume we gave them permission in the first place, before my time, as it turns out. But so there would have been a whole set of arguments. So for me to now judge what the loss of that revenue is, how do I, can I have some numbers, please? How many guests? What was the prediction? So on and so forth.
So the guest house permission was under permitted development rights. So there would have been no requirement for a business case. It just had to comply, a bit like the application we considered earlier. It would have had to comply with the requirements of the general permitted development order, and it was for a flexible use. So it could have been a shop or a restaurant or a cinema. It was a flexible use, and within those uses, they chose the guest house use. But the permitted development order would not have required, my understanding, a business case. So we wouldn't have had that information, I'm afraid.
Okay, and there's no indication anywhere that I can see. Please point me to if I'm missing it. But where is the number of the loss of revenue?
So we requested information from the applicant on the guest house use, and none has been provided. They said that their pandemic meant that it didn't get off the ground and they're not able to provide.
I can believe it would zero, but that wouldn't be what. Surely they had some kind of plan, because it was cost a fair bit to convert. So
yeah, we as I say, we've requested it, but nothing's been submitted. So
okay, so we're just guessing.
I'm afraid so.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Mrs. Mathers. Any further? Councillor Hooker.
Question, for the officers. Does this committee as such have, I use the word loosely, a power to refuse this application because the applicant has effectively run this business poorly, hasn't advertised it well, has had no business come in? I think we would be on dodgy ground, would we not, if it went to appeal on the fact that we refuse this, as Hilary Cole was suggesting, that we ought to extend this to give them another chance. So if we refused it and said, no, we're not giving them another chance, they've run this poorly, but we refuse.
No, in short terms, but what you would need to consider is if it's the economic implications that that are of concern, then the policy that is relevant is CS10. And as I say, that states that the loss of existing enterprises need to demonstrate that there wouldn't be a negative impact on the local economy. So that would be the consideration I would suggest.
But I think with a badly run business, there's no impact at all because there's no contribution to the rural economy.
No, I in this instance, I guess it was existing, and they say that it was ready in September. I can check the report. Excuse me.
September 20, it says in the report, Chairman.
Thank you.
That it was ready for guests.
Thank you, Councillor.
Yes.
right in the middle of the pandemic, or is about to go into the second lockdown. Yes.
Okay, Councillor Hooker, you're done. Any further questions of officers? Okay, let's open this up now to debate. Anyone want to start me off? Councillor Abbs?
Yeah, thanks. Having listened to this and visited, we seem to be presented with a scenario where if we tried to go straight to it being a private house, being a member of WAPI that had been brought to me in this format, I probably wouldn't have approved it because it opens the doors to all sorts of other stuff. Whether officers would or wouldn't have approved it or recommended it for approval, my feeling is after doing this for 2 years, I probably wouldn't have been inclined to approve it. Therefore, the fact that there's some route by which it can step through to that doesn't lead me to a warm, fuzzy feeling about saying, okay, well, you can have it now then. I think there is an absolute need, and I can absolutely say that this year especially, last year there was a need for it, so not much of a chance from September onwards, I agree, but this year there's certainly a need for more and more places to stay in the UK, so there should be no question about viability at this point in time. And if I'm thinking environmentally wise, then this is a high quality development. It's a high quality guest house. I'd love to stay somewhere like that when I went visiting the countryside. So the economic argument for me is that I think it can make a very valuable contribution to the country, to the economy of West Berkshire, to be honest. All of these are micro bits to the economy. Yes, it's not going to change West Berkshire's budget, but as a whole, it gives us more of selling power to the rest of the country.
Councillor Abbs. Councillor Vickers.
Chairman, I go along with Councillor Cole's suggestion. This is a terrible time to start a guest house business in the middle of a pandemic, but now people are desperate to get staycations. I can't believe that if we refuse this and the owner goes back and really seriously tries and market this property as a nice place where you can chill out in beautiful countryside, as long as you've got a four-wheel drive anyway. I'm sure this will be a success. So I would say that we refuse on the grounds that we do not have sufficient evidence that the business could not succeed under CS10, rural economy. I don't know what the difference between the economic impact of somebody living it as a permanent residence and somebody having a guest house. I guess it's probably better as a guest house with all the additional cleaning and servicing and marketing. I mean, it is a business, it's not a dwelling. So I think I'm all in fact, it's a proposal to refuse actually on the grounds that we do not have sufficient evidence that the business would fail. And maybe a condition that 2 years' time, they come back, and if they still want to convert it to a dwelling house, they prove under what should be very favourable conditions that they couldn't make a go of it.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Does that find a seconder? Councillor Cole? Should anyone want to continue the debate? Councillor Barnett?
Well, I'm obviously going to go along and support this proposal, but I'm also thinking back some years when I was previously on this council, when there has been many a debate about people living in the area and perhaps not necessarily travelling around too far, but looking for country retreats or the opportunity to just move away out of their own domestic environment to a nice property somewhere in the countryside. And also further to that discussion, I remember, is Berkshire an area where people actually holiday or stay? Well, at that time, there wasn't many people. They travelled through West Berkshire, but they didn't actually stay. So I think this might be a good opportunity at the time when we're trying to promote West Berkshire as a place of staycation. We need to test the water, as they say, and see if it's a viable proposition. And I'm sure it probably would be.
Thank you, Councillor Barnett. Councillor Hooker.
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with Councillor Vickers and with Councillor Cole. I think to give this B&B a couple of years to see how it gets on is a fair solution. However, I've been involved in other situations where the argument has been that whatever that facility may have been, I've had no uptake. And I think the council has asked proof of who the advertising agency is, how long it's been in. It's been put in a viable price. It's no good saying I've got a B&B and it's £1,000 a night. I've got nobody to take it. So I think as a part of this 2-year consideration, whether we can go that far or not, I think there ought to be something in the condition there that when they bring it back, if it's unsuccessful, we need to see some proof of who it's been advertised, how long it's been advertised for, and how much it's a competitive rate. Thank you, Chairman.
Mrs. Mellors.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment that I understand the reason for refusal put forward. In terms of the condition, we wouldn't apply a condition per se to a reason for refusal, but we could put an informative on that we felt 2 years is an appropriate time frame if that's how members wished.
Thank you very much. Members, any further questions or any other points for debate? Councillor Vickers, would you be happy with the proposal there?
I'm happy to withdraw the request for conditions, and if it can go through without conditions, I don't think, officers may advise if we do need conditions, but I don't think we've got the reasonable evidence, and it does appear that the applicant needs to show evidence that they can't make it a going concern, and we haven't got that evidence for understandable reasons. It can't really be proved either way in the middle of a pandemic, but hopefully, touch wood, we're coming out of it soon, if not.
Let's hope so. Councillor Vickers, thank you very much. Okay, unless anyone else would like to speak, I have a proposal there, Councillor Vickers, seconded by Councillor Cole. The recommendation is that the head of development and planning refuse planning permission subject to conditions. Members, can I have a show of hands, please? And that is unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm now going to pass over to Mrs. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. Clearly we can't debate and consider the item number 4.2. I would recommend that the matter is deferred on the basis that gives us some flexibility, because we don't know what the applicant will do in relation to the first application. It's likely that they may appeal, or there are various options at this point. So I would suggest under 762 that we put a motion. If someone is prepared to put that forward for a deferral and seconder, and then they will take a vote. That's if the chair agrees.
Mrs. Mayor, thank you very much. Councillor Vickers, please.
Yes. Do we have to put a time frame on the deferral, or is it an indefinite deferral?
Mrs. Mayor?
Indefinite initially, because we need to see what happens in terms of, the applicant's got a certain length of time to appeal. It could be withdrawn. They could put in another application. So I think at this point, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
I mean, what I wouldn't want, Chairman, is that we have an appeal against the second one for non-determination because we've deferred it.
Understood.
I mean, I presume that we have to give a reason in our decision, that the reason for deferral is to await the applicant's next move on the other parallel application or something like that.
Yes.
Mrs. Mayor, and that's something that we can draw up that text.
On that condition, I'm happy to propose it.
Okay, I have a proposal from Councillor Vickers. Councillor Cole? Seconding Councillor Cole. I'll take a show of hands then, committee, please. And that is unanimous. Thank you very much indeed. Well, members, I think that concludes the fun and games for this evening. It's been emotional and nothing short of intense, and it may be my first, it may be my last stint in the chair. Who knows? Thank you very much indeed. And if you like to sit tight while Mr. Oliver closes us down for the evening, thank you all very much indeed.